For 3 long years, silence had wrapped itself around little Sophia Carter like an unbreakable chain. At only 7 years old, she carried a grief far too heavy for her small shoulders. The sudden loss of her mother had stolen not only her laughter but also her voice. Her father, Richard Carter, a man of immense wealth and influence, could buy anything the world had to offer, except the sound of his daughter's voice. Richard had tried everything. He consulted the best doctors, brought in child psychologists, and surrounded Sophia with toys and comforts. Yet every effort ended the same way, with her eyes lowered, her lips sealed, and her silence deeper than words. What once had been a home full of bedtime stories and cheerful giggles had now become a mansion haunted by deep, quiet sorrow. Sophia's silence was not defiance, it was pain crystallized into stillness. Each day, Richard watched her move through life like a shadow, present in body but absent in spirit. He longed for even a whisper, her name spoken softly, or the innocent laughter that used to echo through the halls. But the sound never came. What broke Richard's heart most was remembering how Sophia once sang songs with her mother, her voice pure and bright like morning sunlight. Now that voice had been locked away by grief, and Richard feared he might never hear it again. He refused to give up hope, but each passing day made him wonder if silence had become her only way of surviving a world without her mother. It was a crisp, golden afternoon when Richard Carter decided to try once more. He had almost given up hope, but something in his heart told him he couldn't stop trying. His daughter, Sophia, sat silently in the back seat of the car, her small hands folded neatly on her lap. She hadn't spoken a word in 3 years, not since the day her mother's coffin was lowered into the ground. No therapist, no teacher, not even Richard himself had been able to pierce through the wall of silence that grief had built around her. But today, Richard carried with him a fragile hope that perhaps the ordinary laughter of other children could reach her in ways he never could. When they arrived at the playground, Sophia stepped out slowly, her blonde hair falling across her pale face. Richard watched her walk toward the swings with that same quiet stillness that defined her days. Other children ran past shouting, giggling, climbing, their joy filling the air with life. Sophia, however, simply lowered herself onto a swing and sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the ground beneath her shoes. Richard's heart ached. He sat down on a bench nearby, silently praying for a miracle he no longer truly believed in. And then, it happened. 2 little girls burst into the playground, their energy like a spark that instantly brightened the space around them. They were sisters, Maya and Lena Johnson, both around Sophia's age. Their dark curls bounced as they ran, and their voices rang out like bells. The sisters wore bright clothes that matched their lively spirits. And they laughed without hesitation, pushing each other playfully toward the slide. Richard noticed them immediately, their joy a stark contrast to Sophia's quiet figure on the swing. What caught him most off guard was what happened next. Unlike so many children who ignored Sophia's silence, or gave up after she failed to respond, Maya and Lena ran straight toward her. Lena stopped in front of the swing, tilted her head, and smiled with the kind of innocence only children can have. "Hi," she said brightly. "Do you want to play with us?" Sophia blinked, her fingers tightening on the swing's chains. She didn't speak. Normally, this was the moment other kids would shrug and run away. But not these two. Maya leaned closer, grinning. "We're going to build the biggest sandcastle in the sandbox. You should come help us." "What's your name?" Richard's breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward on the bench, his hands trembling. He had seen this scenario play out dozens of times before. Someone asked Sophia a question, waited, grew impatient, and then walked away, leaving her deeper in her lonely silence. But Maya and Lena didn't walk away. They laughed, repeated their invitation, and even began describing how their castle would have towers and a moat filled with crocodiles. And then, the impossible happened. Sophia lifted her head. Her lips trembled as though caught between fear and longing. Richard pressed his hands together tightly, hardly daring to breathe. And then, in the softest whisper, a sound slipped into the air. "Sophia," she said. It was her name. Just one word. But to Richard, it was more powerful than any symphony. His eyes filled with tears, and he gasped aloud. For the first time in 3 years, his daughter had spoken. The sisters didn't understand the miracle they had just witnessed. They simply clapped and cheered, thrilled that their new friend had answered them. "Sophia," they repeated. "Come on, Sophia," let's build the castle. Richard wiped his face quickly, afraid his emotions might scare her away from the fragile moment. He watched, hardly believing, as Sophia slid down from the swing. Slowly, cautiously, she followed the two sisters to the sandbox. There, the transformation continued. At first, she only watched as Maya and Lena dug into the sand, shaping towers with their small hands. But soon, she reached forward, copying their movements. The sisters included her effortlessly, asking her where the walls should go and who should live inside the castle. At one point, Lena pointed at Sophia and said, "You can be the princess." Sophia's lips curved into something Richard thought he'd never see again, a faint smile. And then, a quiet giggle escaped her. Richard pressed a hand over his mouth, overcome. Not only had she spoken, but she had laughed. The sound was fragile, uncertain, but it was real. It was the very same laughter he had once heard when her mother chased her around the garden. As the castle grew taller, Sophia began whispering suggestions. The tower should be higher. There should be a secret tunnel. The princess needs guards. Each word was like a miracle, each sentence a victory. Maya and Lena celebrated her ideas as if they were treasures. And with every response, Sophia's voice grew steadier. Richard sat frozen on the bench, tears streaming down his cheeks. For years, expensive specialists and endless patience had brought nothing. Yet here, in less than an hour, two playful sisters had unlocked the silence that grief had sealed shut. It struck him then with a clarity he couldn't deny. Sometimes healing doesn't come from experts or money. Sometimes, it comes from the simple kindness of children who refuse to give up. By the time the sun began to set, the sandcastle was complete, surrounded by an imaginary moat filled with crocodiles. The three girls laughed together, shouting out new stories about knights and dragons. And for the first time in years, Sophia wasn't a silent shadow. She was a child again, smiling, laughing, and alive. Richard whispered her name softly from the bench, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knew he had just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. The next afternoon, Sophia Carter was awake before the sun. For 3 years, her mornings had been slow, heavy, and filled with silence. But now there was something different in her eyes. A quiet sparkle of anticipation. She pulled on a simple dress without needing her father's reminder, then hurried downstairs where Richard Carter sat at the table, sipping his coffee. He nearly dropped the cup when she whispered, "Playground?" It was the first time in years she had asked for something on her own. Richard's heart swelled. With a fragile joy, and without hesitation, he nodded. At the playground, Sophia's gaze darted immediately to the sandbox. Her two new friends, Maya and Lena Johnson, were already there, laughing as they traced circles in the sand. When they spotted her, their faces lit up. "Sophia!" they shouted in unison, running toward her. To Richard's amazement, Sophia's lips curved into a shy but genuine smile. She ran a few steps to meet them, her blonde hair flying in the breeze. The three girls quickly sank into play as if no time had passed. They returned to their sandcastle from the day before, repairing towers and digging deeper moats. Maya suggested adding a garden filled with imaginary flowers, while Lena proposed a treasure room hidden beneath the castle walls. To Richard's astonishment, Sophia whispered ideas of her own. "We should build a library," she said softly, "with tall shelves and big windows." The sisters clapped in delight. "That's perfect," Maya exclaimed. They treated Sophia's words as if they were precious gems, encouraging her each time she spoke. And with every small suggestion, Sophia's voice grew a little stronger, a little steadier. When their castle was complete, the girls stretched out on the grass nearby. Maya began to talk about her dream of becoming a teacher, someone who could help other children learn and laugh. Lena, more spirited, declared she would be a doctor, saving lives and making her parents proud. Their words were full of excitement and hope. Then they turned to Sophia. "What about you?" Lena asked gently. Sophia hesitated. For a long moment, she stayed silent, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. Richard held his breath, afraid the question might push her back into her shell. But then, Sophia whispered, "I don't know yet." Her words were hesitant, but they carried truth. And instead of mocking her uncertainty, Maya smiled warmly. "That's okay. You'll figure it out. You have plenty of time." Richard, listening from the bench, felt his chest tighten with emotion. In that brief exchange, something monumental had shifted. For the first time since her mother's death, Sophia was not only speaking but also sharing pieces of herself, her uncertainty, her curiosity, her willingness to connect. The afternoon passed quickly as the three girls invented new games. They chased each other around the slide, pretended to be explorers searching for lost treasure, and even crafted crowns out of grass for their imaginary kingdom. Sophia laughed, a sound so pure and long absent that Richard closed his eyes just to absorb it fully. It was like music he thought he had lost forever. As the girls played, they also shared stories about their families. Maya and Lena spoke proudly of their parents, describing the crowded little house where they lived with several siblings. They told tales of helping their mother wash dishes and sweep floors, of evenings filled with noise and laughter despite the challenges. Their voices sparkled with pride, even when they mentioned hardships. Sophia listened intently. Her own world was so different: quiet hallways, expensive toys, a mansion that felt more like a museum than a home. She had everything money could buy, but little of the warmth that filled the sisters' small household. Her eyes widened with curiosity as she heard about their dreams, their crowded dinners, their simple joys. And then, for the first time, Sophia added her own story. In a halting voice, she described afternoons spent in her mother's library, reading picture books together while sunlight streamed through tall windows. Her voice trembled, but Maya and Lena listened with unshaken interest, their faces gentle with understanding. They didn't pity her, they simply accepted her story as part of who she was. Richard's eyes blurred with tears. He realized then that his daughter had found something all the specialists and therapies had failed to give her: true companionship. Friendship was coaxing her out of silence where logic and money had failed. By the time the sun began to dip low, the girls were sitting shoulder to shoulder, drawing shapes in the dirt and whispering secrets. Sophia's cheeks were pink from laughter, her hands sandy, her voice quiet but steady. Richard stood slowly from the bench, overwhelmed with gratitude. For the first time in years, he wasn't watching his daughter simply exist, he was watching her live. As they left the playground, Sophia glanced back at her friends and whispered to her father, "Tomorrow?" Richard swallowed hard and smiled. "Tomorrow," he promised. That evening, as he tucked her into bed, he realized the truth. The healing his daughter needed hadn't come from wealth or from carefully constructed therapy plans. It had come from something beautifully simple: friendship. The laughter of two ordinary girls had done what money could never buy. And in their presence, Sophia was finding her way back to the world. The friendship between Sophia Carter and the Johnson sisters deepened with each passing day. Every afternoon, Richard brought his daughter back to the playground, and each time, he marveled at how much brighter she became in their company. Her once muted world now echoed with soft laughter, whispered secrets, and the beginnings of confidence he had thought lost forever. But while the children built castles of sand and worlds of imagination, Richard began to notice something else, something that weighed heavily on his mind. He had always assumed that the sisters came from a life as carefree as their laughter. Yet one afternoon, as he sat on the bench watching them play, his attention drifted to a conversation nearby. A woman stood a short distance away, her face lined with exhaustion, though she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her clothes were simple, worn from use, and her voice carried a tired strength as she spoke to another parent. Richard leaned forward slightly, catching fragments of the conversation. "My husband still hasn't found work. The rent is overdue again. I'm doing all I can, cleaning houses, but it's not enough." Richard froze. The woman was Mrs. Johnson, Maya and Lena's mother. He glanced at the sisters, who were laughing with Sophia, their eyes bright and free of worry. And then he looked back at the mother, standing with her hands folded tightly together, her expression carefully hiding the weight of her family's struggle. For the first time, Richard saw the contrast clearly. His own daughter had every material comfort but had lived in silence and sorrow. These girls, with almost nothing, radiated joy and resilience, and behind their laughter was a mother, fighting desperately to keep her family afloat. That evening, the truth weighed heavily on him. He sat in his study long after Sophia had gone to bed, staring at the walls lined with books he never read anymore. He thought about the countless sums of money he had wasted on therapies, toys, and comforts for Sophia. None of it had healed her. Yet the daughters of a struggling mother had given her back her voice. The next day at the playground, Richard gathered his courage. As the girls played, he approached Mrs. Johnson. She greeted him politely, her eyes wary but respectful. "Richard, introduced himself properly, and thanked her daughters for the joy they had brought Sophia. His voice broke slightly when he admitted, "They have given me back a piece of my daughter. I thought I had lost forever." Mrs. Johnson's eyes softened, though she said nothing. She listened quietly as Richard carefully brought up the subject of her struggles. He mentioned he had overheard part of her conversation, and though he meant no intrusion, he wished to help. Immediately, her posture stiffened. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Carter," she said firmly, "but I cannot accept charity. My daughters must grow up knowing their mother stood with dignity. I want to work for what we need, not take handouts." Richard was taken aback. Most people, when offered help by a man of his means, would have welcomed it with gratitude or even greed. But here was a woman who valued her self-respect more than comfort, who chose dignity over ease. In that moment, admiration replaced his surprise. "I understand," Richard replied quietly. "And I respect that. Perhaps, instead of charity, I could offer something else, a real opportunity." Mrs. Johnson studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing, as if to test the sincerity behind his words. Richard continued, explaining that his company was large and always in need of dependable employees. He told her he could arrange a stable position, not as a favor but as a recognition of her determination and work ethic. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Mrs. Johnson exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "If it is honest work," she said at last, "then I will accept. Not for myself alone, but for my children." Relief and respect filled Richard's chest. "It will be honest work," he assured her, "and you will be valued for it." From the sandbox, laughter erupted as Sophia called out, her voice soft but audible, telling Maya and Lena to protect the castle from imaginary dragons. The sisters obeyed gleefully, circling the sand structure while Sophia giggled from the center. Richard's eyes burned with tears. He turned back to Mrs. Johnson, his voice husky. "Your daughters have given my child something no doctor or teacher ever could. This is the least I can do, not charity, but a fair chance." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly, and for the first time that day, a small smile touched her weary face. That night, Richard tucked Sophia into bed and kissed her forehead. As she drifted to sleep, still smiling from her day of play, he thought about the strength he had witnessed in Mrs. Johnson. Her refusal of charity, her insistence on dignity, it humbled him. For years, he had believed money could fix everything. But now he understood that healing came not from wealth, but from love, resilience, and friendship. His daughter had found her voice not through riches, but through the laughter of two girls who had almost nothing. And in their mother, he had found a lesson more valuable than any fortune. That true strength is not measured by what you own, but by what you refuse to surrender, your dignity. The next morning, Richard made the necessary calls. By the end of the week, Mrs. Johnson would begin her new job at his company, and as he watched Sophia run ahead to meet her friends once more, he knew that this was only the beginning of something greater, not just for his daughter, but for two families whose lives had unexpectedly intertwined. For weeks, the bond between Sophia Carter and the Johnson sisters grew stronger, and Richard Carter cherished every moment of transformation he witnessed in his daughter. She laughed more freely, spoke in soft but steady sentences, and even began humming to herself at home. It was as though the silence that had chained her for 3 years was finally breaking apart. But while Richard saw this friendship as a blessing, others did not. At the playground, whispers began to rise among parents who watched the 3 girls playing side by side. Some tilted their heads, murmuring, "Isn't that the Carter girl? Why is she always with those children?" Others spoke more bluntly, questioning why the daughter of a wealthy businessman spent her afternoons with girls from a poor neighborhood. Richard noticed the stares, the quick glances filled with judgment. He clenched his jaw but tried to ignore them. He knew children cared nothing for wealth or status. To Maya and Lena, Sophia was simply their friend, yet the adults around them seemed determined to see differences where none mattered. The real blow came at school. One morning, Sophia walked into the classroom with an unusual brightness in her step. She had begun to tell her classmates about her new friends, shyly sharing their names and the games they played. At recess, however, her excitement turned to dread. A group of children circled her on the playground, their voices sharp with cruelty. "Why are you always with those girls?" One boy sneered. "They're poor. They just want your dad's money." Another girl added with a giggle, Do they even have real toys, or do they just play with trash? The words cut like knives. Sophia froze, her small fists trembling at her sides. For 3 years, she had lived in silence, too fragile to defend herself from anything. Now, when faced with ridicule, she felt fear rise in her chest. But behind that fear came something stronger: anger. Images of Maya and Lena laughing beside her flashed in her mind. The way they clapped when she whispered her name, the way they treated her like a princess in their sandcastle. Stories, the way they never once gave up on her silence. They were the reason she had found her voice again. And now, those same friends were being mocked by children who knew nothing of their kindness. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "Stop it," she said firmly. Her voice, though soft, carried a weight that silenced the group for a moment. But the boy smirked and stepped closer. "What are you going to do? They don't belong here, and neither do you if you keep playing with them." Something inside Sophia snapped. With a burst of courage she didn't know she possessed, she shoved the boy away, her voice rising louder than it had in years. "Don't insult my friends." Again, gasps rippled through the children. Teachers rushed over, pulling them apart. To the adults, it looked like a fight, an act of aggression from a girl who had always been quiet. The boy pointed at Sophia, claiming she had started it. She tried to explain, her voice shaking, that she had only been protecting her friends, but her words were dismissed. She was scolded in front of everyone for pushing. That evening, Richard received a call from the school. Alarmed, he rushed over, his heart pounding when he heard his daughter's name linked to a fight. Sitting in the office, he listened as the teacher described the incident, careful to highlight Sophia's push but leaving out the beges, cruel words that had provoked her. When the meeting ended, Richard took Sophia's small hand and walked her outside. She looked up at him nervously, her eyes wet with fear that he would be disappointed. But Richard knelt to her level, his voice gentle. "Tell me what really happened." Haltingly, Sophia explained. She told him about the laughter, the cruel mocking of Maya and Lena, and how she couldn't stand still while they were insulted. Her voice quivered, but her conviction was clear. "They gave me back my voice, Daddy. I couldn't let them be treated like that." Richard's chest tightened with pride and sorrow all at once. He hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did the right thing." That night, as Sophia slept peacefully, Richard sat in his study, consumed with thought. He remembered the whispers at the playground, the judgmental glances of other parents, and now, the cruelty spreading among the children at school. It was no longer just about Sophia's healing, it was about protecting the bond that had given her new life. He realized society's prejudice was far stronger than he had anticipated. People clung to invisible walls of wealth, race, and background, passing down their judgments even to the children, and yet, his daughter had faced it head-on, refusing to let anyone shame the friends who had saved her. Richard knew then that this friendship was not something fragile to be hidden, it was something worth defending. He made himself a quiet promise. No matter the whispers, no matter the criticism, he would stand by his daughter and by the Johnson family. Their bond had brought Sophia back from silence. And nothing, not judgment, not gossip, not prejudice would take that away. For the first time in years, Richard didn't just feel like a father watching over a broken child. He felt like the father of a brave girl, one who had found not only her voice but the courage to use it. And he vowed he would match her courage with his own. For a time, Richard Carter believed the worst of their battles was behind them. His daughter was smiling again, her voice returning piece by piece, and the Johnson sisters had become an inseparable part of her days. Even Mrs. Johnson had begun her new job at his company, carrying herself with quiet dignity and determination. It seemed, for once, that life had found a gentle rhythm of healing. But then, like a storm breaking without warning, everything shattered. One morning, as Richard unfolded the newspaper at breakfast, a headline screamed across the waist. Front page. Millionaire CEO, accused of favoritism and secret relationship with employee. The article was laced with poison. It suggested that Mrs. Johnson had been given her position, not because of her qualifications, but because of Richard's personal interest. Some lines even hinted at a romantic entanglement between them, twisting kindness into scandal. The truth of her hard work and the innocence of their children's friendship was buried beneath lies meant to sell papers. Richard's hands trembled as he gripped the paper. Across the table, Sophia nibbled on her toast, unaware of the venomous words staring back at her father. He quickly folded the paper, hiding it from her eyes. But his mind raced. He thought of his board of directors, his investors, the whispering colleagues who would see this story not as fiction but as fuel for suspicion. By mid-morning, the damage had spread. At the office, whispers filled the hallways. Employees exchanged glances when Richard walked past, their voices hushed, but their judgment clear. He was summoned to an emergency board meeting where directors demanded an explanation. Calmly, Richard insisted the truth. Mrs. Johnson had been hired on merit, nothing more. But he could see it in their eyes. Doubt had already been planted. Across town, Mrs. Johnson learned of the article when a neighbor handed her the paper, concern etched on her face. Reading the words, her heart sank. She felt humiliation pressing down on her chest. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because gossip had twisted her dignity into scandal. That evening, when Richard arrived at her modest home with Sophia, he found her waiting, with weary eyes. She held the folded newspaper in her hands. "I can't let this continue," she said softly. "My daughters don't deserve to live under rumors like this. You don't deserve to have your name dragged through the mud because of me." Richard shook his head fiercely. "You've done nothing wrong. You've worked honestly, with dignity. This is slander." But she stood firm. "It doesn't matter what the truth is, Mr. Carter. People believe what they want to believe. If my presence in your company threatens your reputation, then I'll resign." The words cut him deeper than any headline. He tried to protest, but she silenced him with quiet strength. "I have lived with hardship before. I can live with it again. What I cannot live with is knowing that I destroyed the man who gave my children hope." From the corner of the room, Sophia's small voice broke the silence. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. She clutched her father's sleeve. "You can't leave. Please, don't go. They're my friends. You're not allowed to take them away." Richard knelt beside her, pulling her close as she sobbed. Her words pierced him with both pain and clarity. The friendship that had saved his daughter was at stake, threatened not by silence this time but by the cruelty of society. He realized then that hiding or retreating would not protect them. It would only give power to the lies. That night, Richard sat alone in his study, staring at the folded newspaper on his desk. For years, he had lived with silence, watching his daughter shrink into a shadow. Now that she had found her voice again, he could not let prejudice and scandal steal it away. He knew what he had to do. The next afternoon, Richard stood before a hall filled with reporters, cameras flashing like relentless lightning. His board had begged him to issue a short, diplomatic denial, but he had chosen something bolder. He walked to the podium, his expression calm but resolute. He began with the story the public did not know. He told them of his daughter, how she had lived in silence for 3 years after her mother's death, refusing to speak a single word. His voice cracked as he described the countless nights he had prayed for a miracle. And then, he told them how it came, not through wealth, not through professionals, but through 2 little girls at a playground who had treated his daughter with kindness when no one else would. They gave her back her voice, he said, his words echoing across the hall. No rumor, no scandal, no prejudice will ever diminish that truth. He explained that Mrs. Johnson had been offered a position not because of favoritism but because she was hardworking and deserved the chance to support her family with dignity. He declared firmly that the accusations of impropriety were lies meant to harm both families. "This is not a story of charity or scandal," Richard said, his voice strong. "It is a story of friendship that has healed wounds money could never touch." The room fell silent. Some reporters tried to press him with questions about the alleged relationship, but Richard faced them with unwavering resolve. "There is no scandal here. Only the truth of what kindness can do for a broken child." By the time he left the stage, the weight in his chest had lifted. For the first time since the article appeared, he felt control returning, not because he had silenced the world, but because he had spoken with courage. That evening, Sophia hugged him tightly, her voice trembling but proud. "Thank you for telling them, Daddy. Thank you for telling the truth." And in that embrace, Richard knew he had chosen the right path. The battle against lies and judgment was far from over, but he would fight it openly, honestly, for the sake of his daughter and the friendship that had brought her back to life. The morning after Richard Carter's press conference, the world seemed strangely quieter. Where once headlines had screamed accusations, now they carried a different tone. Clips of his speech spread rapidly across television and social media. People replayed the moment his Voice broke as he spoke of Sophia's 3 years of silence, and how 2 little girls had accomplished what no amount of money or specialists could. The public, once eager to believe the worst, began to shift. Parents wrote online that his words had moved them to tears, praising his honesty and courage. Commentators on television debated less about scandal and more about integrity. For the first time, Richard's reputation was no longer under attack, it was being rebuilt, stronger than before. At his company headquarters, the board of directors met again. Only days earlier, suspicion had clouded the room. Now, even the most skeptical among them admitted the tide had turned. Investors who once feared scandal now expressed admiration. "You faced the truth with dignity," one director said. "It saved not only your image, but all of us as well." Richard listened quietly, grateful, but knowing the credit did not belong to him alone. The real victory was happening elsewhere. In the playground, laughter returned in full force. Sophia, Maya, and Lena played as though no shadow had ever touched their bond. Their games grew louder, their stories more elaborate, their friendship unshaken. Sophia's voice, once fragile, now carried across the sandbox with clarity and joy. Each word she spoke was another triumph. Another reminder that the truth had defeated the silence of grief and the silence poison of lies. Mrs. Johnson, too, noticed the change. No longer did she walk with the heaviness of gossip pressing down on her shoulders. People in the neighborhood greeted her with warmth, some even apologizing for believing the worst. She continued her work at the company with pride, knowing she had earned her place and carried her dignity untarnished. Richard often sat at the playground bench, watching the 3 girls. Their hands dirty with sand. Their laughter ringing through the air, they seemed untouched by the weight of the adult world. Yet he knew their bond had already changed lives, theirs, his, and now perhaps many others. The truth had won. Lies and prejudice had tried to tear apart something pure, but transparency and courage had reversed the tide. And as the sun dipped low, painting the playground in golden light, Richard felt a deep peace settle in his heart. His daughter was free, her voice restored. The Johnson family stood proudly beside his own. And 3 little girls, once separated by silence and circumstance, were now bound by something unbreakable: friendship. From the seeds of a simple friendship, something extraordinary was born. Inspired by the way Maya and Lena had helped Sophia rediscover her voice, Richard Carter established a support center for children who had suffered loss and trauma. It wasn't filled with expensive equipment or complicated therapies. Its heart was built on play, imagination, and connection. Here, children learned that silence could be broken not through force, but through kindness. Sophia, once imprisoned by grief, now stood beside her 2 friends, as a quiet but powerful symbol of hope. Maya and Lena's laughter carried through the halls, their energy lifting children who had forgotten how to smile. Together, the 3 girls showed that healing doesn't require wealth or perfection. It only requires love, patience, and the courage to reach out. The story closed not with riches, but with something richer. Proof that friendship can mend what sorrow has broken. That courage can rise from the smallest voices, and that dignity and love have the power to overcome the deepest wounds. In our world, pain and loss are unavoidable, but healing always begins with connection. Sometimes, the greatest miracles come not from money or status, but from a hand that reaches out in friendship and a heart willing to listen. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. What does friendship mean to you? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss another story of hope and courage. Together, let's spread these messages of love and healing to even more people.